Welcome to the first week of class. In this video, I want to focus on an overview of personality. And I want to start with a definition of personality. You see here this first bullet point. I want to break it down into its pieces. So first we have the word unique. Everyone's personality is different. Everyone has a unique personality. It is relatively enduring, meaning that personality is not quick to change. It is changeable, but for the most part, it takes quite a bit of time and experience for someone to change their habits, their behaviors, their thought processes. It also involves both internal and external aspects of the human. When I say internal, I'm talking about things like thoughts, emotions, your motives. External aspects would be your behaviors, the things that other people can see external to you. And then the most important part of the definition is that personality, the abstract term personality, influences how we act in different situations because it's our typical way of being. So in different situations, we still behave in that typical way. That typical way, those typical behaviors can be defined as our personality. Personality is much more complex than just a list of adjectives. It is more than things like I am sociable, I am happy, I am intelligent. Personality is more than those things. It includes the way we feel about ourselves, the way we think about ourselves, but personality can also be defined as the way other people see us, the way other people perceive our behaviors, and the assumptions they make about how we think and feel. Again, personality it doesn't change quickly. It's not like you can wake up tomorrow and be a different person with a different personality. It takes time and it takes experience, and sometimes it takes active participation in order to change our personality. And it is possible to change, but difficult, and it doesn't happen suddenly. The last bullet point, our personality not only impacts how we behave in certain situations, but it also impacts the situations we choose to put ourselves in. It impacts our expectations of those situations, and it impacts the decisions that we make in different social situations. Personality and social media, these two topics, the integration of these two topics is a very hot topic in personality psychology today. I've got 3 boxes here with 3 different questions. I ask you to explore these questions in the discussion board. It's one of the options. Do people present their real selves on social media? There is evidence to support both a yes and a no answer, but it does appear that many people, at least, the personality they project on social media does tend to match up with the personality they exhibit in real life. However, does the use of social media, does it influence, does it change our personality? It is possible. There is some evidence that the more people use social media, the lower they rate their psychological well-being and also the quality of their relationships with other people. Makes sense. The more time you spend online, the less time you're spending in real life, cultivating, maintaining those relationships. Does the use of social media differ with different personalities? This one's interesting. We do find that there is a certain type of person that tends to use social media more than others. Extroverts, that's one group that likes to use social media. The people you see posting selfies, many a times those individuals actually are extroverted in real life. We also see that narcissists tend to use social media at a higher level than the average person. So it could be that there are other groups as well that use it to a different degree, but we have a good amount of evidence to support that at least extroverts and narcissists tend to use social media at a higher level. When it comes to race, gender, culture, even age, sexual orientation, some of the other demographics that you often read about in psychology. When it comes to these characteristics, personality theory is disappointing. Since the beginning of the study of personality, since Sigmund Freud began his work, the research in personality has focused on European white males in 30s, 40s, and 50s. The group of people that were studied in the early years were not really a diverse group. Many of them had contacts at the universities at which the theorists worked. So you can imagine that probably income level also played a role. The individuals who were showing up for therapy with Freud and Jung had the means, the funds to pay for that therapy. So in addition to these characteristics, there are also other characteristics that were not represented in the early research. So you have to remember that these first few weeks, as we're covering different models and different theories, just remember that the subjects, the participants, the individuals who gave that theorist their information about their thoughts, behaviors, feelings, those individuals come from a small subset of the population. And this last bullet point, we have made improvements, yes, but it's still a struggle across all fields to get a truly representative sample in our research. Something to keep in mind as you read research. The cross-cultural research that we have available to us suggests that personality development is impacted by both nature and nurture, by both our genes as well as our environment. And there's a long list of cultural differences that play a role in personality differences. I have two here. When it comes to raising children in individualistic cultures, there's a tendency for parents to be more permissive, to allow children to get away with bad behavior when they shouldn't, and to negotiate with children. More so, it's more common to do this than it is in collectivistic cultures. Parents in collectivistic cultures are more authoritarian. They limit their children's activities, and they do tend to apply punishment more often. It's not harsher punishment, it's just they correct their children's misbehavior. So those differences, whether you are surrounded by an individualistic culture or you're surrounded by a collectivistic culture, that difference may contribute to how your personality develops. The last bullet point here, when it comes to the tendency to promote ourselves in front of other people, individuals in individualistic cultures tend to be more self-promoting, while people from collectivistic cultures tend to be more humble and not like to be in the limelight and not like to brag about any of their accomplishments. So again, those differences are going to impact how people develop their personalities. Personality assessment is a multi-million-dollar industry. It's not just personality psychologists who are usually clinical psychologists. It's not just personality psychologists who are involved in this industry. There are a lot of companies that make their money by creating personality tests and then selling them to different companies to be used for, as you can see here, diagnosing abnormal personality, education, counseling, and then also research purposes. Throughout this class, I will show you several different personality assessments, including ones that are valid and reliable. I'll show you a few that aren't, just to show you, but I will show you different examples of personality assessment. The tests that come out of personality research, the test itself is actually an application of the research. The research data provides information that we use to form these tests, and then we test the tests to make sure that they're testing what they should be testing. When a personality test gives us the at least similar results, consistent results, say over time, imagine that you take a personality test right now, and then in 6 months you take that same personality test, you take it again. A reliable personality test will give us similar scores. Now, we know that personality can change a little bit over time, right? And so it's possible that your scores might be slightly different, but we also know that it stays fairly stable over a 6-month period, so your scores really shouldn't change all that much. A reliable test will give us similar scores across those 2 different times. Essentially, a valid test is a test that we can provide evidence that this test is actually measuring personality. Validity has to do with whether a test is measuring what you say it's supposed to measure. Some of you have maybe taken an exam, and one of the questions on the exam had nothing to do with the topic in class. One of my stats exam in graduate school, one of the very last questions asked what the professor's daughter's name was. I'm sure he had talked about it in class, but it was not something I wrote down in my notes. It was not something I studied. That question, asking, what's the name of my kid, is not valid. That's not a valid question. That is not assessing my understanding of the knowledge in that class. An invalid personality test might actually be assessing just your preferences for music, or your preferences for media, or your political affiliation, not necessarily your personality. It's very important that we pick valid tests that have been validated by research and statistical methods. It's very important that we pick these particular tests, because the implication can cost us a great deal of money. In employment situations, if an employer uses an invalid personality test and gets caught, either because it discriminates and they get taken to court and the test gets validated and we find out it's not valid at all, in these situations, it can cost millions of dollars simply because someone didn't do their homework on that particular test. It's very important to pick both reliable and valid tests. When we assess personality, we use a variety of different methods. There are 6 here. I'll cover each one briefly and give you some examples, advantages, disadvantages. The most common method is what we call a self-report inventory. This is essentially when you sit down with a pencil, a pen, and fill out a test that asks about your thoughts, behaviors, emotions. The most popular example is the MMPI. I have an example here. Test publishers are much like textbook publishers. They do not want you sharing their tests online. And so it is very difficult to find an actual MMPI. I just happened to come across this when I was searching one day, grabbed it. I went back 2 days later, it was gone. So I'm glad I took a screenshot of it. Do not share this with anyone, because you will receive a letter in the mail from a lawyer telling you to take it down immediately. And I am not lying. So the advantages are that they are quick. We can score them objectively, but most importantly, we are collecting information from the person of interest. The disadvantages with this type of test is that people can lie, right? That's the main disadvantage, is you can circle yes, no, ABC, you can present yourself in the way that you want to present yourself based on your answers. Many of the best personality tests have what we call lie scales to try to prevent this. So a lie scale question might be something like, I've never lied. I've never lied. We've all lied. So if you mark true, I've never lied, your personality test will get flagged by the system, because everyone has lied, at least told a white lie in their lifetime. And so if you're marking true, it might be because you want me to think you've never lied. That would be an example of a lie scale. Many of the self-report inventories, the good ones, do have lie scales within them to try to prevent the social desirability responding. Online test administration. Many of the self-reports can be placed online and the system can be automated. This is less time consuming, it's less expensive, easier to score it objectively. Online test administration doesn't need my eyes or my brain. That the test results can be automatically fed back to the person taking the test. Younger employees tend to prefer online personality test administration. And again, with lie scales and instructions and other cool technology, there are ways to minimize faking. Here is an example that I would like for you to check out. We will talk more about the Big Five personality model later on in the semester, but if you want an example of a reliable, valid Big Five personality test, we are lucky to have this particular option available to us. Projective tests were the first tests. They were popular in the early 1900s. Today, we don't really use projective tests. There are a few clinical psychologists who still use them. They are more useful for assessing abnormal personality than they are for assessing normal personality. For example, many of you are familiar with the Rorschach. I have an example of that particular test here. You can also check this one out if you have some time. Now, this is not the actual Rorschach test, but it's a pretty good example. It's the best one that I was able to find. I took quite a few of them, and this one aligns, I think, best with the original Rorschach. The thematic apperception test, different word associations and sentence completion tests are also considered projective tests. And essentially what these assessments do is present ambiguous stimuli, maybe an image of two people. They're having a conversation. That's all you really know. Or the ink blots, or a sentence missing a word. We present ambiguous stimuli to the test taker, and then we record their responses. We pay attention to what they say, how they answer it, the behaviors that they use. All of those things are then used to infer that person's personality, their needs, their motives, their interests. These tests, unfortunately, have low reliability and low validity. Clinical interviews are usually conducted by clinical psychologists, and these interviews involve a conversation between the assessor and the test taker, if you want to think about an interview as taking a test. But essentially what the psychologist does is sits with the patient, the test taker, and asks a series of questions, really tries to get to know that person. And depending on their perspective, whether they're based in Freudian psychoanalysis or they're more of an Adlerian psychologist, depending on their perspective, they'll ask different questions and try to find out, different theorists pay attention to different things. So some theorists will pay attention to childhood, other theorists will pay attention more to things like goals and the future. The advantages of these interviews are that someone who is trained, someone who has experience in assessment, can collect that information firsthand, not from a paper pencil test, but from a conversation. So you get richer detail during a clinical interview than you would with taking a test. And of course, the disadvantage of a clinical interview is that you have one person assessing another person, very subjective results. It is possible that that particular psychologist, maybe they're having a bad day, or they don't really like the patient, or they've had a bad experience with the patient. Any of those issues can affect the results of the interview, the report. Behavioral assessments can be made during clinical interviews. The clinician will pay attention to the things that an individual talks about, but they'll also pay attention to things like body language and facial expressions. The idea is that if someone, for instance, like me, you'll see me use my hands a lot. If someone is using their hands a lot, that might mean fill in the blank. Behavioral assessments, like clinical interviews, are going to give you insight that you wouldn't otherwise get from a paper and pencil test. However, it is difficult to measure behavior. You essentially have to record a patient and then go back later to tally up and take notes regarding their behaviors. How many times did they smile? How many times did they use their hands? How many times did they squirm? How many times did they switch positions? That's not an easy process to do. Thought sampling and experience sampling are older methods that have become more popular today because of advancements in technology. Thought sampling is asking participants to record their thoughts. Experience sampling adds context to those thoughts. With experience sampling, it's more like journaling, where participants describe not only what they're thinking, feeling, but also what they're doing, the situation, what other people are doing and saying, what's going on in the situation. So experience sampling takes a little bit more time than thought sampling, but both of these methods are conducive to technology. With a smartphone, or any smart device for that matter, participants can be prompted throughout the day at specific times. Every day at noon, for instance, they can be prompted at different times to, text back their answer or write it in an app. There are apps out there, yes, today that help collect this type of information. These methods they're quick. They're online, so they have a lot of the advantages that online assessment has. But the most important advantage of these particular methods is that we get some more information about what's going on around the person. So much of personality research is focused on the psychology of an individual, right? The person themselves. But we don't always understand what's going on around that person. Maybe that behavior is actually abnormal because of the situation or given the situation. This type of sampling helps fill in those blanks about what is going on in that person's environment. The problem is that participants can ignore the prompts. Maybe they forget to write down their ideas. Participants are known, not a lot, but this does happen. Sometimes participants feel bad that they forgot, and so they'll make up a journal entry, not knowing that that's actually worse than just not doing it at all. So that can be a problem for researchers when they're crunching the numbers and analyzing those writing samples. If those writing samples are not representative of a true person's personality, then what good is that person's data? It really doesn't tell us who they truly are. In moods and emotions, while we consider them in personality, they're not the whole picture. And so emotions and moods can impact whether you respond to the prompts, and they can also impact your answers. So once again, we may not be getting a true sample of who you are in terms of your personality. When it comes to race, gender, and culture in personality assessment, it's important to remember that we cannot generalize personality tests made in the United States in English and validated with populations from the United States. We cannot generalize those tests to other nations. If we were to make a personality test here at SIUE, for instance, that test, while it may tell us something about the students here, it may not tell us much about a student in California, a student in New York, a student in another country. What is normal, the second bullet point, what is normal in one culture may not be normal in another culture. So therefore, the items on personality tests, they don't always translate well. They don't always make any sense. They're not always relevant. And sometimes our tests miss important components of personality in other cultures. When it comes to personality research, we use a couple of different methods: the clinical method, the experimental method, the virtual research method, and the correlational method. The clinical method involves the case study method, where we study the personality of a single person, one person. The advantage of doing this is that we get a whole bunch of information about one person. And it's often collected, that information is collected over a long period of time. As you can imagine, it's very time consuming. It's very expensive to conduct a thorough case study. And typically we use this method to study abnormal personality. Sometimes we use it to study, say, a celebrity, but in many instances, the case study method is the preferred method to study an abnormal personality. Someone who behaves, thinks, does things that society does not perceive as normal. So the first thing that comes to mind might be convicted murderers. The case study method is often used to try to understand how their past life and their life at the time of the crime impacted their particular behavior. Incredibly subjective method, because we're only studying a single person. Yes, we get a lot of information about that person, but it's just one person. A murderer very well could be very different than the rest of us, we hope, right? And so collecting data from them may not help us understand the personality of individuals who do not commit murder. The experimental method is the gold standard across psychology. The problem is it's a little bit more difficult to use the experimental method to study personality because the requirements of an experiment are hard to meet in this particular subfield. The experimental method is the only method that allows us to study cause and effect relationships. And even then, we can never, ever, ever, ever say A caused B. We just can't. We can get really close to understanding and making predictions about whether A causes B, but we can never say with certainty that A 110% of the time causes B. So we can study these relationships, we can never prove them with certainty. For a study to be truly experimental, it has to have random assignment, meaning that when the people in our study, when they enter our study, they get put into two different groups: the experimental group and the control group. The group they end up in must be random. It must be random assignment. I can't place you in a group as you walk in the door, and it's done through a numbering system. But just know random assignment is essential to experimental method. Without random assignment, it's quasi-experimental. It's not a true experiment. You must have control over the procedures, meaning that you must try to minimize the effects of other variables that you're not paying attention to. So for instance, if age is not important to your study, you would still want to collect information about age and in your statistical analysis, control for it. Experiments must have an independent variable, a variable that is manipulated, changed, messed with in some way. There's also a dependent variable. That's the behavior or the outcome that we are measuring to try to see if there's some difference or if there's some change. The experimental group is going to experience that manipulation, the treatment, while the control group doesn't experience it. One of the things that we might do is we could look at the amount of time spent on social media and its impact on personality. The independent variable could be, the variable that we manipulate, could be the number of hours spent on Facebook. And let's say we'll have two experimental groups. One experimental group will spend 20 hours a week on Facebook. The other experimental group will spend 40 hours a week on Facebook. We can compare those two groups, look at the differences in their data to determine if social media use has any impact on personality. So the independent variable would be number of hours spent on social media. The dependent variable, the thing that we're trying to measure, would be change in personality. We might collect data. We might assess someone's personality 6 times, once a month over a 6-month period. Every week, that person has to either spend 0 hours if they're in the control group, 20 hours or 40 hours on social media. We might collect that data for 6 months, then compare. We would want to look to see if individuals who used social media more time spent on social media, if that is related to a change in personality. And because we've randomly assigned people to the different groups, the control group, the two experimental groups, because we've tried to control the procedures, we've brought people into the lab, we've recorded the amount of time they've spent on Facebook, things like that. Because we have all of these things, what we have is an experiment. The experimental method, it's the only method that we have to study these cause and effect relationships. If I manipulate this variable and there's a difference, something about me manipulating that variable must have had an impact, assuming you're controlling for things in the environment, which is often why we bring people into the lab, because we have more control in the lab. So the experimental method, it is well controlled, it is systematic, it is the most objective of the methods that we have, but there are certain topics we cannot manipulate personality, we cannot manipulate the way someone was raised. There are creative ways of going about it, collecting information after the fact, but that's quasi-experimental. That's not truly experimental. So just really difficult in this particular topic. Virtual research methods are very popular today. In fact, I rely on Mechanical Turk specifically to conduct opinion surveys and collect information from people all over the world. Many of you are familiar with crowdsourcing platforms like GoFundMe, where a variety of people come to the website, and with GoFundMe, they give money, but with Mechanical Turk, you come to the website and you fill out tests and opinion surveys, and you can make a little bit of money. And I'm talking like 5-10 cents per test. You won't get rich doing it, but you can get Amazon gift cards and a small amount of money for participating in this particular type of research. The advantage is that we can access a lot of information. I can collect data from people all over the world. I don't have to go anywhere to do that. I can do it from right here. Fast, it's inexpensive, relatively inexpensive. Once you get the process set up, it's fairly inexpensive. The problem is, once again, just like with self-report inventories, people can lie. And now they're on the computer, behind a computer screen, and we don't always have all of the controls that we might have put in place if that individual were to come into our lab and take a paper and pencil test right in front of us. And then there is some evidence that the people who participate in Mechanical Turk may not be representative of the population. It may be that the majority of people on Mechanical Turk are somewhat computer savvy, and so therefore I'm unable to collect personality data from people who are not technically savvy. The correlational method is one of the most popular methods that we use to study personality. This method measures the nature of a relationship between two variables. So say amount of television you watched as a child, variable A, versus level of aggressiveness, variable B. We can't manipulate the amount of time you spent watching TV. That is, in the past, we can't manipulate it. We can't study that using an experimental method, but we can study it using a correlational method. And we would ask you to estimate the amount of time you spent watching television. We might ask your parents, we might ask your siblings to corroborate, get an average. And then we would maybe observe you in a group to find out, to try to collect information about how aggressive you are in relation to other people. Correlational method looks at the nature of the relationship. It looks at both the strength of that relationship, how strong is watching television and aggressiveness, how strongly are those two variables related, and then it also looks at the direction of the relationship. The relationship between two variables is represented or expressed by a statistic we call the correlation coefficient. This number ranges between -1 and +1. The closer the number is to 1, whether it's negative or positive, the stronger the relationship. So if the relationship between watching TV and aggressiveness was really, really strong, the more TV you watch, the more aggressive you are. Because those two variables are headed in the same direction, we would consider that a positive relationship. There's the direction, positive, the plus sign. And if it's not extremely strong, but if it were really strong, that number would be closer to a +1. It might be a 0.8. So in some cases, the data from a correlational study can be used to make important predictions, but we can't study cause and effect relationships, so I would put it at silver. It's not the gold standard. We'll give it the silver. I've got a couple of examples here, some basic examples that you might see in a statistics textbook. When it's hot outside, people buy more drinks, cold drinks. When it's cold outside, fewer people buy cold drinks. This is a positive correlation. Temperature goes up, number of people who purchase cold drinks goes up. Because all of the dots, all of the cases, all of the examples of a human being walking into that gas station and buying a cold drink, because they hang around this line, we know that this correlation is a bit stronger than if the dots were spread out all over the screen, as you see here. So this first example, the positive correlation, the correlation coefficient would probably be plus 0.6 plus 0.7. A negative correlation, the hotter it is outside, the fewer the number of people who wear sweaters. The colder it is outside, the more people wear sweaters. Here, this is a negative correlation because as the temperature goes up, as it gets hotter, the fewer people wear sweaters. It very much depends on the variable that we're looking at, right? So when temperature goes up, people buy more drinks, there's a positive correlation. But when the temperature goes up, people also wear fewer sweaters. So here we have a negative correlation. Once again, because the dots hang around this line, we can infer it is probably positive 0.6, positive 0.7. Here, as the temperature changes, temperature change won't have much of an impact on hiccups. Altitude will impact hiccups, but not temperature. And the dots are all over the place. A theory, just think of it as a set of ideas. We will begin to learn about different personality theories next week. Each one of these theories has its strengths, its weaknesses. In fact, the first few personality theories that we cover aren't even supported by research today. We learn about them so that you can understand where we've been, and because Sigmund Freud is the most popular personality theorist on the planet. The theories that we will learn about, I find this to be so interesting. The theories we learn about in this class were impacted by the experiences of the theorist's life. The things that happened to Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, Karen Horney, the things that happened to those individuals impacted their theory, their set of ideas about personality. This is one of the reasons why sometimes the theories don't stand the test of time and aren't supported by modern research. It's because the theorist was basing their ideas on their own life experiences, not on the majority of people's experiences, but on their own life experiences. When it comes to personality theory, we evaluate different models using the concepts you see here. Free will versus determinism. Some theories propose that our personality develops by choice, that we have some say in how our personality emerges over time. Other theories suggest that personality development is determined by something other than free will, by our genes, our DNA, or by childhood experiences. Some models combine the two and say it's both. It's a little bit of both. Different theories have different views in terms of nature versus nurture. Once again, some theories combine the two and say it's both. Again, some theorists think that childhood played a role, some don't. Some believe that personality, for the most part, is unique, that every single person has a different personality, while others think that there are some aspects of personality that are universal, that everyone shares. Theorists look at the motives involved in our behaviors. Some believe that humans are driven to satisfy some need, some desire. Other theories suggest that humans are motivated by growth and the desire to be a better person, to develop more skills, learn more knowledge, be the best that they can be. And finally, we can evaluate different theories in terms of how optimistic or how pessimistic they are. The first few theories that we cover are relatively pessimistic compared to the other theories. Part of that comes from the context, what was going on in psychology in the early 1900s. It was a time of studying abnormal personality. And so the early theories take on a more pessimistic view because they were built around data from abnormal personalities. More modern day approaches to personality take a bit more optimistic approach. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you next week.